Okay, let's carry on, moving swiftly on. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Rizwaan Sabir to speak for about 10 minutes about Prevent and all the issues that emanate from it.
Thank you, Tahir, and thank you very much to the organisers and, of course, all of you for coming down this evening, I should say. 10 minutes, I'll try my best, Tahir.
Please, you
So I want to just get straight into it. I want to start with the general framework that how we essentially diagnose a problem very much dictates our response. And some of the comments made by Rob were actually, in fact, Marianne and Rob's kind of comments and Tahir's as well kind of gives my paper for me, so I'm just thinking now whether I should actually speak or not. But let me just start with the kind of general kind of framework.
This is Dr. Rizwaan Sabir.
Oh yes, you skipped my intro. Sorry, but we can do that at the end, all right? I kind of know semi what I'm talking about. Let's just leave it at that. So how we essentially dictate a problem very much, how we diagnose a problem very much dictates our response. So the current Prevent kind of framework or the policy views religious ideology to be at the so-called heart of the threat that we currently face. It's not politics, but it's religious ideology. Now there is an entire discourse and discipline dedicated to the study of new terrorism, which stipulates a series of factors which distinguish pre-9/11 terrorism associated with the ANC, the IRA, ETA, the Tamil Tigers and so on and so forth, with post-9/11 terrorism and political violence. Now without delving into the intricacies of that, I want to highlight what the problems with viewing the opponent as a religiously motivated opponent is. Firstly, when you say that the opponent is a religiously motivated opponent who undertakes violence in order to cleanse the world of moral decadence, you pathologize the opponent and you classify the opponent as evil. There can be no reconciliation or negotiation with evil. It must be fought wherever it is found. It must be confronted and challenged in every single setting. Second problem with this claim is that it's historic revisionism. If you go back to the 1800s and you pick up the literature and have a look at the bombings that took place here in London and across other places throughout Europe, you find a movement known as the anarchists, right? They were also blowing up individuals that seem to resemble and mirror what we have today in Paris and in Brussels and in London and so on and so forth. So this decontextualizes and dehistoricizes opponents that have challenged state power. And thirdly, by claiming that this is new terrorism, what we essentially do is that we say that all the lessons that we've learned on how not to confront the threat of political violence, whether it's in regards to the IRA or ETA or whatever it is, that we can sideline those and we need to devise a new framework for dealing with this. And of course, policies like internment and so on and so forth, which were so extremely counterproductive in dealing with the threat of political violence in the north of Ireland, what we find is that we're developing a new infrastructure that seeks to do exactly the same thing, but just calls them control orders or calls them terrorism prevention investigative measures, a form of house arrest and so on and so forth. So this whole claim that this is a new terrorism is flawed within its own right. Terrorism has always been about violence in order to influence a group of people, in order to secure political objectives. There is no distinction between old and new terrorism. So if I'm making the argument that this is not about religious ideology, then what role does ideology have to play? Does it have no role to play? No, I'm not saying that. Ideology does have a role to play. The power of ideology serves to legitimize an action, not to cause the action. So terrorism may well be justified using scripture and Islamic texts and so on and so forth, but it doesn't cause the violence. And this is a very, very key point. Because if we for one moment ignore all the evidence and all the reams and reams of scholarship that has been done on this particular issue, and we for 1 second just accept what the Home Office and the government is claiming, then what we essentially, or we accept that ideology is indeed at the root or at the heart of the threat that we face, then we can see why universities and education settings across the board have become kind of central spheres in the so-called British war on terror. Now, in democratic societies, I'm, by the way, having to speed talk right now because I've only got 10 minutes. I don't usually talk this fast. So in democratic societies, universities are, of course, meant to be largely free and open spaces. But it's claimed by the government that these places have been hijacked. They've been hijacked by political Islamic groups such as Hizb ut-Tahrir in the 90s and other groups who I'm not going to call or list at the moment. And in order to justify and defend this position, the Prevent strategy cites a really persuasive set of figures. It says that 30% of the people that have gone on to become involved in acts of political violence have attended a university. Now, this is what statisticians would absolutely jump off a bridge for, because this is correlation, not causation. To say, this is like saying that an individual who went to state school and shopped at Marks and Spencer's went on to become a terrorist. Yes, but they're going to state school or going to Marks and Spencer's for shopping, even though the prices may prompt someone to become a terrorist, does not necessarily cause an individual to become involved in acts of political violence. This is a correlation, not causation, a very important point to make. So as a result of these kind of statistics that are used to defend and justify the targeting and now the legal duty on institutions like universities to report and refer future terrorists. Now we're in the territory of dealing with Tom Cruise and Minority Report here, because we're not actually dealing with criminal conspiracies or plots, we're dealing with people who may go on to become future terrorists. And it's precisely the people that may go on to become future terrorists that is leading to cases such as the University of East Anglia, where a student, of course, being a good diligent student, accessed Blackboard in order to view a website containing extracts from the ISIS magazine Dabik, and was subsequently referred or approached by Special Branch and interrogated and questioned. The other case is Muhammad Omar Farouk, a very notable case at the University of Staffordshire, reading a book by Professor John Horgan and Kurt Bradcock in his university library, and he finds himself being scrutinised by the university under the remit of the Prevent strategy. Now, of course, many people argue, and many people have argued to me, including Prevent practitioners and police officers, that Prevent is the lesser of two evils. Prevent is not about arrest. So unlike my own case where I was wrongly detained and held for 7 days in solitary confinement and then released without charge because I was alleged to be a suspected member of Al-Qaeda, and then 3 years later, after fighting a legal case, won £20,000 in the courts and so on and so forth. What essentially the police said to me, or these practitioners said to me, was that, Rizwaan, you must be jubilant now that we're not arresting people, but we're subjecting them to Prevent. And I still turn around to them and say, whilst it's factually correct that you are no longer arresting people, I am still not going to buy this claim that the Prevent policy is actually a good policy. And the reason I'm not buying into it, because in practice, in its outcome, the effect of the Prevent policy is very similar to that of arrest, detention, and so on and so forth. Invisible power still has a disciplinary effect, and I will explain this to you in 1 second. Once I've skipped some of this talk, because I'm definitely not going to be able to get through all of it. So I want to talk to you about the concept of surveillance and intelligence. Now, Prevent, by placing a legal duty on members of staff to refer and report individuals who are not involved in criminal conspiracies or acts of political violence or planning them, but future terrorism, what it essentially does is it creates an infrastructure in which overt intelligence will be collected. We're not talking James Bond here, we're not talking Jason Bourne, we're talking overt collection of intelligence. The same stuff that a police officer or a beat bobby will speak to you on the street, and he will realise what you are doing, and if it's of interest, will communicate that to the relevant authorities or systems or whatever it is, right? So this is overt intelligence, it's not the stuff of James Bond. But the point is that when you have a system in place in which information is being collected and potentially communicated to law enforcement authorities, the impact of having such a policy is the same as covert intelligence. And if you have a look at contemporary scholarship, and I'm not going to cite Derrida here, but I'm going to cite Catherine Brown and Tanya Saeed, who did a fantastic study on looking at Muslim students on university campuses, and what they essentially found was that Muslim students, especially female Muslim students, because of the fear of being profiled and surveilled, were not even involving themselves in mainstream party politics. They were actually so terrified that they were referring to, quote, quiet activism, or a form of kind of disengagement from political participation, even mainstream. So what this basically means in sum is two things. One, Prevent is claimed to be about soft policies, but actually if you realize that the collection of overt information and intelligence is operating in the same capacity as covert intelligence collection, in practice, it has the same coercive impact. It still leads to the spreading of systematic fear, especially for those individuals who speak through what Professor Salman Sayyid at the University of Leeds calls the language of Islam. The people who choose not to accept Eurocentric and Western-centric discourses and narratives, but actually realize that the world may be governable according to a different system of power, Islam, right? So they are the individuals, political Muslims basically, that get the kind of attention or the focus of this thing. So what we find is through other forms of scholarship, is that by closing down this discussion and this debate, we actually are creating the conditions which are conducive to terrorism. We are actually creating the environment in which terrorism and political violence become more likely. Now this needs explaining. The research shows that terrorism and political violence usually prosper in closed and repressive systems of power. Go back in history and have a look at the Muslim Brotherhood, how they then formed into Islamic Jihad, how they then formed into the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, how that then mutated into Al-Qaeda, and how Al-Qaeda mutated into ISIL, and the rest, they say, is history, right? But it's all there, 2 minutes left, almost there, right? So the whole point is that we've got this system in place that is repressing individuals and closing down discussion and debate, and the scholarship shows that it's precisely these conditions which lead individuals to become involved in acts of terrorism and political violence. So at the moment, I would say PREVENT is actually increasing the risk. Now in summary, I will say this. PREVENT claims to be about protecting and about safeguarding. It claims that it's there to counter and disrupt the ideology of terrorist group by working in partnership with Muslims and civil society organizations and public sector workers and so on and so forth. Now if it did such a thing, the sentiment from within the Muslim community wouldn't be so negative as it is today. If it did such things, the Home Office would not need to plant information into the public domain, I'm talking about the RICU here, via third parties, and essentially conceal its own involvement in disseminating particular messages. We're talking here lying through omission. By not disclosing something has the same effect as lying through commission, right? So it's lying through omission, by using propaganda, by framing that the problem with PREVENT is not one of actual policy or how it diagnoses the problem of terrorism and political violence, but by claiming this is a PR problem that we've got and that we can navigate and maneuver our way out of this by paying a particular media company or manufacturing a civil society organization and throwing money at them in order to create the solution. So regardless of what the supporters of the PREVENT strategy may claim, in practice, on the ground, the strategy is spreading fear, and it is actually serving as a complementary policy to a coercive infrastructure that does deal with arresting people and imprisoning them. So overall, I would say this, that in practice, the effects of the policy are extremely detrimental to learning and teaching processes. It is closing down discussion and debate, and as a result, it's actually creating the very conditions that don't cause terrorism, because there is no one cause of terrorism, unlike the Home Office, right? But what does cause terrorism, or what increases the risk of terrorism, is closing down discussion and debate. And the PREVENT policy is actually doing that really well. We'd actually be safer without such a policy. Thanks.
Lots of food for thought there. I'm sure it will stimulate some discussion between us as well as with you later on. But if there's any quick questions, remarks now, I'd like to take them and put them to Rizwaan, or we can save them for later. Okay, that's a confirmation for later. Well, thank you very much. I'm always amused by the statistic that 30% of terrorists are university educated. Yet 50% of the population is university educated. Yeah, there we are. So, okay.